Somewhere in Iran's Lorestan province, the Polac petrochemical refinery is no longer standing. It is not damaged. It is not partially operational. It is gone, engulfed in a fire so severe that provincial emergency services have publicly acknowledged the blaze is overwhelming every containment effort thrown at it. Thick columns of smoke visible from miles away. Flames consuming infrastructure that Iran desperately needs to continue building the weapons it has been launching across the region for the past week. And here is the detail that changes everything about what this explosion means. There was no airstrike. No American aircraft were in the area. No cruise missiles tracked on radar. No strike packages announced. No CENTCOM statement claiming the target. Something, or someone, went in on the ground, and one of the most critical industrial facilities in the Iranian weapons production chain simply ceased to exist. The mysterious explosions are back, and they have returned at the exact moment that President Trump announced on Truth Social that the ceasefire against Iran is officially over, that both American aircraft carriers in the region are pushing north toward Iranian waters with fighter jets in range and aerial refueling tankers already active over the Persian Gulf, and that the United States has left instructions of a kind that should make every senior figure in the Iranian government understand precisely what the consequences of their most extreme actions would produce. This is not one story. It is three stories converging at the same moment, and the convergence is not coincidental. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what the Polac petrochemical refinery actually is, why its destruction matters at a level that no headline about a factory fire can convey, and why the method of its destruction, not an airstrike, not a missile, but something that happened on the ground inside Iran, is the most alarming signal for the Iranian security apparatus of everything that has occurred in this conflict so far. Petrochemicals are not a civilian industrial category that happens to sit near military facilities. In the context of Iran's weapons manufacturing architecture, petrochemicals are the foundational input layer of the entire production chain. Rocket propellants for ballistic missiles require petrochemical feedstocks. The explosives that fill warheads require petrochemical precursors. The solid fuel that powers the Shahab 3 variants and the shorter-range ballistic missiles the IRGC has been launching at Gulf state cities throughout this conflict is derived from petrochemical processes. Motor casings for ballistic missiles require petrochemical-derived materials, the sealants, the adhesives, the rubber gaskets, the polymer components that go into drone airframes, guidance systems, and launch infrastructure. All of it traces back to the petrochemical production chain. When you understand that, the significance of what is just burned in Lorestan province stops being about a factory and starts being about Iran's ability to continue making the weapons it is currently firing. Every ballistic missile the IRGC launches this week drew on stockpiles that the Polac facility contributed to building. Every drone that targets a cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz contains components that petrochemical processing made possible. And now one of the most important nodes in that production chain, one of the biggest petrochemical plants in the country, is consumed in flames so intense that firefighters cannot contain them. This has happened before. That is the second detail that matters enormously, and that the immediate news coverage is not connecting with sufficient weight. Before this conflict's current phase began, in the months that preceded the open military exchange, there was a pattern of mysterious explosions and fires at Iranian critical infrastructure facilities, power stations, industrial facilities, military-adjacent installations. A pattern that security analysts attributed to a covert sabotage campaign operating inside Iranian territory, a campaign that nobody officially claimed and that Iranian authorities could not publicly attribute without acknowledging the penetration of their security perimeter. The same pattern appeared during the ceasefire period when the guns fell nominally silent, but the mysterious fires did not. And now, in the first days of a renewed military exchange, at the moment of maximum pressure on the Iranian military-industrial system, the same methodology has produced its most consequential result yet. Someone is operating inside Iran. Someone with access to one of the most sensitive industrial facilities in the Iranian weapons production supply chain. Someone who can reach that facility, execute an action that produces a catastrophic fire, and exit without being identified, without triggering an immediate Iranian security response that the international community can observe, and without leaving the kind of attribution trail that an airstrike or a drone strike automatically produces. The identity of the actors responsible is unconfirmed. The operational possibilities include American Special Operations Forces, Israeli Mossad operatives, Iranian opposition groups with access to the facility, or some combination of assets coordinated by intelligence services with the operational reach and the long-term penetration of Iranian industrial security to make this kind of action possible. What is not in question is the result. The facility is gone, and the result is the same, regardless of which flag the operators were carrying when they produced it. Now layer on what President Trump announced in the same operational window. The Truth Social post is worth examining with precision because its construction is deliberate and its implications extend well beyond the immediate ceasefire declaration. Trump stated that Iran has asked to continue talks, that the United States has agreed to continue talks, and that the ceasefire is, in the same breath, officially over. Read that construction carefully because those three elements in combination represent a strategic architecture that is more sophisticated than it appears on the surface. What the simultaneous maintenance of a negotiating channel and a declaration that the ceasefire has ended actually creates is a two-track pressure system, whose value is precisely in the contradiction it presents to the Iranian negotiating team. If the ceasefire is over and bombing continues while talks nominally proceed, then every day that the talks do not produce an Iranian concession is a day in which additional targets are being struck. The talks are not a pause in the military campaign, they are a running clock with explosions in the background. The negotiating leverage is not a threat of what happens if talks fail. It is the live demonstration of what is already happening while talks continue. Iran is not being offered a choice between talking and being struck. It is being offered the experience of being struck while talking, and the implicit question embedded in every airstrike and every mysterious refinery fire is, how much more of this are you willing to absorb before the talks produce something real? This is negotiating with bombs. It is a doctrine as old as coercive diplomacy itself, and in the specific context of an Iranian leadership that has demonstrated it will violate signed agreements the moment it calculates that violation serves its interests. The alternative, trusting a pause in military operations to maintain sufficient pressure for diplomatic compliance, has already been tried and has already failed. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding was the test case. Iran signed it. The IRGC violated it. The ceasefire that preceded the current exchange was the test case. It produced the conditions for the petrochemical refinery fire and the carrier repositioning that are now unfolding simultaneously. The two-track approach, bomb and talk, strike and negotiate, maintain the diplomatic channel as a visible option while making the military option the dominant reality, is the conclusion drawn from watching the single-track diplomatic approach produce a signed agreement that the IRGC ignored at the first opportunity. Iran's immediate response to Trump's Truth Social post was predictable to anyone who has watched the Iranian negotiating pattern in this conflict. Iranian state media and sources close to the negotiating team immediately denied that any talks were finalized, that any preparations for meetings in Islamabad were underway, or that any technical discussions had been agreed to. Fars news agency flatly contradicted the Trump statement, with a source described as close to the Iranian negotiating team calling reports of continued talks false and without basis in reality. This denial pattern is not new. It has appeared consistently throughout this conflict. Every time the American side signals that a diplomatic channel is open, the Iranian side publicly denies its existence. The denial serves a specific domestic political function. It allows the Iranian leadership to maintain the narrative of absolute resistance against American pressure for a domestic audience that has been told for years that negotiations with the great Satan represent capitulation. Acknowledging that Iranian representatives are talking to Americans while American bombs are falling on Iranian military facilities would create an internal contradiction in the regime's public posture that its propaganda apparatus cannot easily manage. So they deny the talks while the talks proceed through whatever intermediary channels the Qataris and others provide. The reality, according to what the American side is communicating, is that back-channel contact is active. American representatives are in Qatar delivering messages. Iranian interlocutors are receiving them. The content of those messages includes Trump's ceasefire declaration and the implicit logic of what comes next if the military campaign continues to escalate without a negotiated outcome. The denial and the contact coexist because the Iranian leadership needs both simultaneously. The domestic narrative of resistance and the private channel through which to test whether a tolerable exit from an increasingly untenable military position is available. Now look at the carrier repositioning, because the physics of aircraft carrier deployment tell you things about operational intent that no statement can. The USS Abraham Lincoln is approximately 150 miles off the coast of Iran, pushing north. The USS George H.W. Bush is 162 kilometers from Iranian waters and closing. Both carriers are repositioning simultaneously in the same direction at the same moment. This is not routine patrol adjustment. Aircraft carriers do not move toward the coast of a country that has been launching ballistic missiles at American military positions across the region for days, unless the operational planning driving that movement has concluded that proximity to the coast serves a specific strike architecture requirement. The closer the carrier is to Iranian territory, the shorter the flight time from the catapult to the target. The shorter the flight time, the greater the percentage of the aircraft's fuel load available for time on station over the target area. The greater the time on station, the more strikes each aircraft can execute per sortie. The carrier's pushing north is not a show of force for its own sake. It is the physical repositioning of the most consequential strike platforms in the American military arsenal into the optimal position for a strike campaign whose next phase has not yet been publicly announced, but whose operational preparation is visibly underway. The aerial refueling tankers over the Persian Gulf, visible on flight tracking data, confirm that aircraft are already in the air. Refueling tankers over an active theater of operations are not there for training exercises. They are there because fighter jets are in the air, burning fuel and need to remain on station longer than their internal fuel capacity alone would allow. Those jets are patrolling the Strait of Hormuz. They can be redirected into Iranian airspace at a moment's notice. The infrastructure that makes that redirection operationally immediate, the tankers, the ISR assets, the carrier air wings that are now closer to Iranian territory than they were 48 hours ago, is already in position. The decision to execute is the only variable. And the carriers continuing to move north is a visible, trackable, publicly available signal that the operational environment for executing that decision is being continuously optimized. Now look at the kill list, because the most extreme pressure track in this conflict is not the one measured in cruise missiles or carrier positions. It is the one measured in a document that most of the mainstream coverage treats as a colorful sideshow, but that the American national security apparatus is treating with the full weight of its protective infrastructure. President Trump told the New York Post that he has left specific instructions for what happens in the event that Iran succeeds in its plot to assassinate him. He did not hedge the language. He did not qualify it. He said he has left instructions, and those instructions amount to bomb them at levels they have never seen before. He added, in the kind of statement that lands differently when it comes from a sitting president, about a foreign government's active plot against his life, "I hope you will miss me." That is the language of a man who has been briefed on a threat that he takes seriously enough to have formally documented his response directive in advance, but who is sufficiently assured of the threat's manageability that he can discuss it with the casual confidence that denies the adversary the psychological satisfaction of producing visible fear. It is, simultaneously, the most serious national security statement and the most psychologically effective counter-messaging possible against an adversary whose strategy includes psychological pressure as a primary instrument. The institutional apparatus around the threat is operating at the highest level. Israel passed intelligence to Washington about a possible Iranian assassination plot against the president. Intelligence that CNN confirmed was received, though it was characterized as unverified. An Iranian lawmaker named Savedi publicly called on Parliament to fast-track legislation targeting Trump and other American and Israeli officials, turning what might have been a behind-closed-doors internal discussion into a public legislative initiative that is now part of the international record. The Air Force One security protocol change, placing the president on the older VC-25A with its proven defensive systems rather than the newer aircraft, was visible, documented, and reported. The Secret Service's threat assessment is not theoretical. It is operational, and it has produced operational changes in how the President of the United States travels. What Iran's parliament is apparently attempting to do, legislate authorization for assassination of a foreign head of state, is a threshold that no functional government crosses without understanding the consequences. It is not a policy instrument. It is an institution publicly committing itself to a course of action that, if executed, would trigger a military response, whose scale Trump has already publicly described in advance. The instruction he left, bomb them at levels they have never seen before, is not ambiguous. It does not specify conventional ordnance. It does not exclude any category of weapon from consideration. And the public declaration of that instruction is itself a deterrence communication. Iran now knows, in advance and in public, what executing the kill list produces. Whatever calculation an IRGC commander or an Iranian political authority might make about the value of eliminating the American president has to account for the explicit, publicly stated, pre-committed response. The deterrence logic is compressed into one sentence delivered to the New York Post, and it is functioning as deterrence communication precisely because it is too specific and too extreme to be dismissed as rhetorical posturing. Now connect all three threads: the Polac explosion, the ceasefire declaration, the carrier repositioning, because the convergence of all three in the same operational window is not coincidental, and understanding how they relate to each other is the key to reading where this conflict is heading in the next 72 hours. The mysterious explosion at the Polac petrochemical refinery is not a standalone event. It is the latest manifestation of a covert operations track that has been running parallel to the open military campaign throughout this conflict's history. Before the first American aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace in the current phase of fighting, the covert track was laying groundwork, degrading facilities, eliminating personnel, disrupting supply chains, gathering intelligence on the target architecture that would eventually be struck overtly. During the ceasefire, when the overt military track was nominally paused, the covert track continued. The mysterious fires and explosions that appeared during the ceasefire period were the visible evidence of a pressure campaign that never actually stopped, even when the public-facing military campaign did. Now, as the overt military campaign has resumed at its highest tempo, the covert track has produced its most consequential single result to date. A petrochemical plant that is central to Iran's ballistic missile and drone production supply chain has been eliminated, not from the air, where attribution is immediate and Iranian air defense can at least attempt an intercept, but from the ground, where the only defense is security perimeter, integrity, and the only question is whether that perimeter has been compromised. The answer that the Polac fire provides to that question is unambiguous. The perimeter has been compromised somewhere in Iran's Lorestan province, at one of the country's most important weapon support industrial facilities. Someone or some team executed an action catastrophic enough to destroy the entire facility without being stopped, without being identified in real time, and without generating the kind of immediate security response that would have allowed Iranian authorities to prevent the fire from reaching the point of total loss. That is not a security failure at the margins. It is a penetration of the Iranian military-industrial security apparatus at a depth and a level of operational sophistication that should be far more alarming to the Iranian security community than any of the airstrikes being conducted against coastal military installations. An airstrike you can see coming. Radar tracks it. Intercept attempts can be launched. Even if the intercept fails, the origin, the trajectory, and the platform type are all knowable. Ground sabotage is different in every dimension that matters to a security apparatus. You cannot radar track an operative who entered the facility 3 days ago. You cannot intercept a device that was placed inside the building by someone who had access to be there. You cannot attribute the action to a specific country in a way that generates a clean escalation decision because the attribution requires intelligence gathering that takes time and that may be deliberately obscured to prevent exactly the kind of direct retaliation that an airstrike attribution would justify. The mysterious explosion is more destabilizing to the Iranian security architecture than any of the CENTCOM target packages, not because it is more kinetically destructive, but because it reveals a vulnerability that hardened bunkers and air defense batteries cannot address. The threat is inside the perimeter. Now look at the financial and supply chain dimension of what the Polac fire adds to the existing pressure picture, because the compounding effect of this loss, on top of what has already been destroyed in the open military campaign, produces a cumulative damage picture that Iran's military-industrial system cannot easily absorb. The rail corridor through Turkmenistan that connected Iran to Chinese and Russian supply chains has been severed. The Chabahar deepwater port on the Indian Ocean has been struck and its control infrastructure destroyed. The oil revenue license has been revoked. More than 300 Iranian military targets have been struck across 3 nights of CENTCOM strike packages, including ammunition depots, drone launching infrastructure, coastal surveillance systems, radar sites, fast attack boat positions, and naval command nodes. And now the petrochemical plant that feeds the production of the rockets, drones, missiles, and weapons that need to replace all of those destroyed systems has burned to the ground in a fire that has not been extinguished and that the provincial governor has publicly acknowledged is defeating every firefighting effort directed at it. Each of these losses compounds the others. You cannot replace destroyed missiles without petrochemical inputs. You cannot import replacement systems without the rail corridor. You cannot fund procurement without the oil revenue. You cannot use Chabahar to receive alternative deliveries because Chabahar's operational infrastructure is gone. The military-industrial system is being degraded simultaneously at the production layer, the supply chain layer, and the financial layer, in a pattern that is not producing isolated setbacks, but structural incapacity that compounds with every additional loss. The 3 simultaneous pressure tracks that define this conflict's current character are operating at their most synchronized point yet. The military track is producing results that the CENTCOM imagery makes publicly visible. The fireballs, the smoke columns, the before and after satellite imagery of facilities that existed on Monday and are rubble by Thursday. The carrier repositioning toward Iranian waters is the signal that the military track's next phase is being prepared, not wound down. 2 carrier strike groups pushing north simultaneously while tankers keep jets in the air over the strait is not a de-escalation posture. It is an escalation posture with a diplomatic window being held minimally open at the side. The covert track is producing results that are visible in their effects, a burning petrochemical plant, but opaque in their attribution, which is precisely the operational design. The covert track creates losses that Iran cannot directly retaliate against with the same escalatory clarity that an airstrike demands. You can respond to an F-15E Strike Eagle, dropping a GBU-31 on your naval base by launching ballistic missiles at American positions in the Gulf, and both sides understand the exchange as part of the overt military conflict. You cannot respond to a mysterious refinery fire with the same clarity of attribution and the same confident escalation narrative, because the response requires you to publicly name the perpetrator. And naming the perpetrator requires intelligence you may not have or may not want to reveal, because revealing it would show how deeply the penetration goes. The psychological track is running at maximum amplitude simultaneously. The kill list, the parliamentary legislation to authorize Trump's assassination, the Truth Social post declaring the ceasefire over, with the word over in capital letters, the carriers pushing north, visible on satellite and flight tracking data to any analyst who chooses to look. The aerial refueling tankers in the air, an unmistakable signal to any Iranian military commander tracking the operational picture in the Gulf. All of these signals are arriving simultaneously, and they are all pointing in the same direction. The United States is not moving toward de-escalation. It is moving toward an expanded campaign, and the diplomatic channel being nominally maintained is the minimum concession to the argument that military options should be exhausted only after diplomatic options fail. The diplomacy is the cover story for what is operationally already decided. Inside Iran's command structure, the convergence of these three tracks at this moment is producing exactly the kind of institutional stress that leads to the most dangerous decisions. The IRGC hardliners are publicly committed to a posture of absolute resistance that their operational capacity is increasingly unable to back up. The diplomatic track is attempting to find an exit, while the political imperatives of the institution make acknowledging that exit seeking publicly impossible. The covert operations penetrating Iranian industrial security are generating losses that the security apparatus cannot explain to the political leadership in terms that don't reveal the depth of their own failure. And the carriers are pushing north. The structural risk that sits beneath everything else in this moment is not any single strike or any single escalatory decision by either side. It is the decision calculus inside the Iranian command structure when the institution reaches the point where all three pressure tracks have compressed the available options to a point where the commanders who believe in the kill list strategy begin to see it as the only remaining lever that can change the strategic equation. The assassination of a foreign head of state as a military strategy is not an option that rational state actors pursue because the consequences are existential, and the probability of achieving the tactical objective is low against a security apparatus operating at the level of protection that the American Secret Service, military intelligence, and allied services are currently deploying around the American president. But rational state actor calculations require institutional coherence, clear command authority, and decision makers who have access to an accurate picture of the strategic reality their institution faces. In a command structure absorbing this level of simultaneous pressure across military, financial, covert, and psychological dimensions, with succession ambiguity at the top and hardline competition in the middle, the probability that decisions are made outside the rational state actor framework increases in proportion to the pressure being applied. That is the scenario that keeps serious analysts working through the night. Not the carrier positions, not the target count, not even the petrochemical fire. The question of whether an institution under existential pressure, with a compromised security perimeter, a severed supply chain, a frozen revenue stream, a burning industrial facility, and two carrier strike groups pushing toward its coast, makes a decision that changes the character of this conflict from a bilateral military exchange into something that no ceasefire negotiation can walk back. Go back to Lorestan province. The Polac petrochemical refinery, which on the morning of July 13, 2026, was contributing to the production of the ballistic missiles and drones that the IRGC has been firing at American military positions and Gulf state civilian neighborhoods for the better part of a week, is now a column of smoke visible from orbit. The firefighters trying to contain the blaze are losing the battle. The provisional governor has acknowledged the facility is gone. And somewhere in the Iranian security apparatus, someone is trying to answer the question that this fire forces every security official in Tehran to confront. If this could happen here, in a facility this important, what else has been reached that we do not yet know about? That question does not have a reassuring answer. And the carriers pushing north, the tankers in the air, the ceasefire declared over in capital letters, and the instructions left in a White House file describing what happens if the kill list succeeds, all of it is arriving simultaneously in the inboxes of Iranian commanders who are running out of easy options and discovering that the hard options carry consequences that have been publicly pre-committed in advance by the person at the top of their list. The next 72 hours will tell whether the diplomatic channel being nominally maintained produces anything that changes the trajectory. The operational evidence, the carrier positions, the tanker activity, the covert track's continued operation, the strike packages that preceded this moment and that the military infrastructure being assembled suggests are not finished, points toward a trajectory that is not bending toward negotiation. It is bending toward something that the petrochemical smoke over Lorestan province and the over in capital letters on Truth Social are both, in their very different ways, announcing. And the Polac refinery, which is no longer producing the materials that Iran needs to keep its missiles flying, is the most recent and most revealing data point in the picture of where this is going.